Well, thank you, John. And as always, it's great to be back with the ISS and pay tribute to John's extraordinary leadership of this institution. We go back to when John was a fellow as well at the ISS, but I've been really delighted to see the achievements that John has brought to what was already a great institution, but now really has such great global stature. I think it's obvious that the reason I'm on this panel is to be Mr. North in assessing the South-South networks. And I'm going to bring to this discussion a perspective both as a practitioner in the United States, although not clearly as a spokesman for the current administration, but also a bit as a scholar in my current life. And like Ambassador Sibal, I think it's important to begin the discussion by trying to understand the what of this topic as well as the why before we can really decide what the metrics would be to try to assess the measures of success. And as the ambassador said, I mean, the whole concept of South-South has its roots in decolonization and the Cold War, and kind of evokes the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement, which does strike one as a bit anachronistic in this world of globalization and interdependence. And so I think we do have to kind of think about what we're asking ourselves here. And then as we try to define the question, also think about the past experience when South-South seemed more relevant as a concept, and ask ourselves, how would we measure the success of South-South cooperation and strategic interaction during that period? And does that give us any, at least, relative set of benchmarks in which we can evaluate South-South cooperation now? This isn't a history lesson, so I'm not going to spend an extended time on the past. But I think perhaps if I can deeply overgeneralize, and we look at the earlier period when South seemed to have more of an ideological as well as political context, that there was undoubtedly an important perspective in the global strategic environment during the Cold War and during the period of decolonization, particularly as a caucus within the UN institutions, and other international organizations. But I think it's also fair to question whether on an operational level these networks had much impact. And I think that's the place where one wants to look now in terms of trying to see how these new forms of cooperation should be compared, where they clearly have less of a ideological content, but are they delivering, as it were, on an operational level? So as I suggested, with the end of the Cold War and largely the completion of the process of decolonization, certainly the idea of non-alignment became hollow as an organizing principle for South-South interaction. So the question then became, well, what would South-South be for? And I think there are some underlying rationales as to at least why there continue to be interest in this concept. First of all, I think it's obvious that one of the motivations for at least exploring the idea of South-South strategic interaction was a reaction to the arguable, questionable unipolar world, or certainly the disappearance of the bipolar world, and that much of the motivation could be traced to a discomfort from the idea of unipolarity or US global leadership. So that's one rationale for why this concept might still have some relevance. A second is a concern in developing countries that with the end of the Cold War, the North, as it were, would have less of an interest in the economic and political development of the South. That when it ceased to be a battleground, a competitive ground between the United States and the Soviet Union, that the rest of the world would simply turn their back on developing countries, and that therefore there needed to be more cooperation among them. And I think a third reason, and perhaps the most powerful, and I think it very much relates to what the ambassador had to say, is in fact because of the growing capacity of the countries that were formerly the South to actually contribute to the resolution of not just their own internal problems, but of a broader set of problems. That as the countries of the South became more capable and more outward-looking, they became more relevant to thinking about how they could contribute to regional and global issues. Nonetheless, I think the challenges of thinking about South to South, many of the problems from the earlier era remain today. Much as during the Cold War and during the period of non-alignment, it's easier to define a grouping by what you're against rather than what you're for. And so to the extent what brought together the non-aligned movement was not being aligned, so I think much of the political impetus for some efforts in South-South is the idea of what you're against. And certainly you can think of some arguably South-South groupings like ALBA as a grouping whose identity very much comes in part from what they're against. But as in the past, the problem with thinking about South-South cooperation in its broadest terms is just the huge diversity among the countries that are arguably part of the South in size and level of economic development, in geography and ethnicity and religion. So the idea that there are interests common to the South is often belied by the tremendous diversity of interests, and very much manifest in the very sharp conflicts that exist even within the South itself. We heard from the ambassador, you think about India and Pakistan, and the fact that even regional cooperation in South Asia is so inhibited by those conflicts, historically by the tensions between Argentina and Brazil in Latin America, for example. And indeed, even in non-regional context, if you look at the deep disagreements within the developing world about UN Security Council reform, there isn't a single South perspective on how that should be achieved. And so the idea of South-South cooperation in the abstract, I think, is very much challenged by the diversity and diverse interest. Nonetheless, as John suggested, there are things that we sort of look at and might think represent strategic cooperation within the South, or arguably within the South. And John kind of laid in front of us the poster child, which is the issue of the BRICS. But the very fact that this is sort of a product of Goldman Sachs rather than strategic thinking asks the question, but what makes the BRICS a South-South cooperation? Is Russia really the South? Is China really the South? Is India really the South, for all the reasons that the ambassador suggests? And I'll come back to that point later. The idea of the BRICS feels to me a lot like, for those Americans here and those of you who follow American game shows, like Jeopardy. If BRICS is the answer, what is the question? And I think that has been the challenge here, is to try to think about what it is that makes the commonality of interest that would make a kind of strategic grouping relevant. And the work of the BRICS, I think, to date shows that, that on a strategic level, the challenges are very deep, although there may be at least some practical elements of cooperation on the economic side. What are the other examples that we might look to for institutional elements of South-South cooperation? Well, you can look at, for example, the Organization of Islamic States. There's a grouping which arguably consists of a lot of countries that we think of the South, but even there, you think about the tremendous diversity within the OIC, and particularly in the context which we've talked about so much over the last 2 days of the Sunni-Shia split, the idea that this is a strategic organization, I think, is one that raises a lot of questions. And so as we start to look at trying to find examples where we can measure success or to think about operational achievements, I think we are drawn, and I think this was very much part of Ambassador Cibal's argument, to the regional organizations, where I think we can begin to see, whether you call them South-South or not, an emerging set of relationships that do rise to the level of strategic cooperation. And again, I agree with the ambassador that at the leading edge of that has to be ASEAN. Why? In part because it is more cohesive, that there's obviously the geographical dimension, but also lots of ties within the region, although certainly historical divergences and conflicts within the members. In part, I would argue, and I think, again, it comes to his argument as well, that because the strategic dimension of the cooperation has been built on a strong economic foundation, that those economic ties really underpin the ability to cooperate on a political and security level. And also because there is an element of non-alignment, as it were, in what brings the ASEAN countries together, a desire to have a third way in between the two elephants, that is the United States and China. And so you see in ASEAN, which for the reasons the ambassadors discussed and many others could discuss, an emergence of perhaps a strategic perspective. But even here, and perhaps in contrast with the non-aligned movements in South-South during the Cold War, it is a third way, but it is not one that is distant from either of the two powers in the region. That is, the ASEAN's goal is not to be separate from and to distance itself from the United States and China, but actually to provide a bridge between the two and an opportunity for the states of ASEAN to build strong ties in both directions. And that's a theme I want to come back to at the end. Latin America is another interesting case. We were very fortunate to have the very candid but I think accurate assessments from Andres Rosenthal yesterday about the issue of cooperation and coordination within Latin America. We see, with the creation of CELAC, that impulse, which remains today for the reasons I suggested earlier, of an interest of countries in the region to have a forum for cooperation which does not include the United States. But just as we've seen over the past 2 decades with Mercosur, the question of whether just the fact that it's everybody except the United States is going to provide enough of an impulse to make CELAC a operationally significant institution remains to be seen. And the diversity within the members, I think, still, other than the fact that they have in common not being the United States, raises questions about just what the mission or role will be. Particularly given, in contrast to ASEAN, the need to think about whether there is an economic dimension here and how that would relate to other elements of economic integration within the Americas. We also see some evolution on the political front from the Arab League. Again, an institution which has Cold War roots, which also had an impulse of a third way between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then a period with the end of the Cold War of inactivity, but now at least the stirrings of an institution that might be able to play a more active role on the political and security front. And we've seen this, again, as we've heard in some length over the last 2 days, first in Libya, where I think the role of the Arab League was quite important, both on the political and to some extent on the operational role, but now in Syria. And although there are clearly disagreements even among Arab League members there, it is clear that the Arab League, as we heard in the last panel, is engaged and playing a role. Similarly, we see in the African Union and within some of the sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS, a greater attention to and an interest in stepping up to play a role on the political and security front, and to be significant actors with ECOWAS over the last 2 decades in Western Africa, the AU in the conflicts in East Africa as well. And so, again, the emergence of the idea that these regional organizations can play a security and political role, and that there is now capacity within these organizations to do so. So you have this sort of idea that the 2 necessary ingredients, both the will and the capability, beginning to emerge in all of these regional organizations. The last one that I think has to be mentioned in terms of thinking about regional cooperation is the question of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. Is that also a place in which regional cooperation could emerge? Again, asking ourselves the question whether this is South-South. I think to date, we've seen that other than being an organization that doesn't have the United States in it, the question about whether there really is a strategic perspective that the SCO can bring to bear is an open one. One of the areas that it certainly tried to explore is in counterterrorism, but even there, the different views of the member states about what constitutes terrorism and where the threats are problematic. And as we saw in the case of dealing with the challenges in the Caucasus, and particularly the Russian intervention in Georgia, deep splits within the membership. So the organization continues, but whether it has a long-term strategic perspective is one that I certainly would be interested in others' view here, but one that I have some question about. So that's regional organizations, and as I say, it seems to me if you're looking for examples where we might begin to develop some metrics of success, we have seen some in those areas. And for the reasons I'll conclude with in a moment, one might expect actually to see even more in the future, but in a different kind of context. The last thing I think should be mentioned, and it was touched on by Ambassador Sibal, is some of the ad hoc cooperation that takes place on a South-to-South basis. And for an American, particularly one who served in the administration, you won't be surprised that one example when we might look at is the question of Turkey and Brazil on Iran, and whether this represents a different kind of form of South-South strategic coordination to play a more active role on global security issues, or whether that was a one-off effort that reflected as much the individual leaders as a strategic alignment between the 2 countries. all of this suggests, in my mind, and again, in this I concur with Ambassador Sebald, that we certainly see on the historically that much of the motivation for the cooperation was economically driven, and that on the issues like trade and investment, the motivation for cooperation among the states of the region are strong, but the problems of diverse perspectives that we've seen in the debates in the WTO continue to represent a barrier to real cooperation among the states, and that these problems are even perhaps more challenging on the security front. But how does an American perspective come to bear? What does it look like to an American to think about these various efforts? I think the first thing to be said, and I think this is why the post-Cold War perspective is important, is that I think for the United States, I certainly hope, and it's certainly my view, that the emergence of these networks such as they are should certainly not be viewed as threatening, even though some of them may have their impulse in trying to find ways of organizing without being in the shadow of the United States, that the danger of these groupings emerging as an anti-American bloc, I think, are small. For a variety of reasons, but most importantly because of the value that most of the countries who belong to this proverbial South see in their ties with the United States. And so the United States, I think, would be poorly served if it sees these organizations as somehow threatening. I remember the days in my previous service in government during the tenure of Prime Minister Mahathir, when there was tremendous anxiety in Washington about the possibility of the emergence of an East Asia grouping that did not include the United States. And I think that in some ways that empowered the effort. It must have been important if the United States was so opposed to it. So I think it would be very misguided for us from an American perspective to see the emergence of groupings, including like CELAC, as a threat to the United States, to the extent that there is an opportunity for cooperation, especially on the regional organization. It seems to me in terms of capacity building and burden sharing, this is very much in the U.S. interest, particularly as seems evident, the United States is stepping back a bit from the role of the world's policeman and the indispensable nation, and therefore the willingness of these other organizations to take on some of these challenges, I think, is very much in an American interest. But the second thing that can be said, and this was not coordinated between us, but it is a concept that Ellen Leibson shared with us last night, which is this idea of hybrid systems, which is that I think what we see emerging is a recognition that we need to have more involvement on the international stage, both regionally and globally, of these emerging powers and the countries formerly known as the South, but that through what she called hybrid systems, and the idea that we now have arrangements in which more and more of these countries are brought in, and obviously the G20 is a very important example of that transformation, in which countries which were seen in past to be the South are now part of organizations that include developed countries as well as developing countries. We see this in a lot of other fora, and so the successor to Mahathir's East Asia community is the East Asia Summit that involves both the United States and China and Russia and India, but also the countries of ASEAN. We see it on the security front in the cooperation between the United States and Europe on the one hand, and the African Union in Western Africa and Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone, in Eastern Africa and Somalia, or recently in Mali. All cases of these hybrid coordination between the North and the South. We see it in efforts like the Obama administration's partnership with South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, Norway, Mexico, and Philippines in the Open Governance Initiative, which is a new model of a hybrid organization to try to deal with the problems of transparency and good governance in a framework that doesn't have either North or South dimensions. We see it in the environment with the Major Economies Forum, again, bringing together countries of diverse respects. And so I think there will continue to be an argument for networks that do exclude the United States and other highly developed countries like Europe. But at the end of the day, most of the challenges that we face require both greater involvement by this so-called South and the developed countries, and the development of these hybrid systems which give a stronger role and voice to developing countries and emerging powers, I think are likely to be the stronger and more important paradigm that we use to measure the success of the international system to meet the challenges of our time.